critical role in every organisation, but it's not easy being a manager in today's world of work. So today's podcasting conversation is all about manager skills, from how well prepared managers are to manage others, to what happens when they are underprepared, and how you can grow really effective managers. I'm delighted to be joined by Anthony Painter, who leads the Chartered Management Institute's Policy and External Affairs. He's an award-winning policy and social innovator and has written for the Financial Times, Guardian, Independent, and many other leading publications. We're going to discuss some of the finding from the CMI's recent landmark study, Taking Responsibility, Why UK PLC Needs Better Managers. And the report assesses the state of management today and the consequences of poor management skills on teams, managers, and the wider organisation. We're going to explore what is it that good managers do that poor managers don't, and what actions leaders can take now to improve their managers' capability. Welcome to the business of being brilliant, Anthony.
Thank you, Helen. Really good to see you.
Thank you very much for coming on the show. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. I follow the CMI's fantastic research with great interest, and actually quoted from it in a number of places in my business book behind me, because I know it's really insightful, very well evidence-based. So I've been really looking forward to talking about your latest report.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you for the endorsement and for quoting our work. Very much appreciated.
And so this most recent study was pretty sizable in terms of number of participants. Am I right? About 4,500 people involved?
Yeah, that's right. About 4,500, probably about just over 1,000 managers, and then we did a workforce survey alongside that. So that was a cross section of workers right across industry sectors, public, private sector, large and small, just to really test some of the responses we've got from managers and see the interplay between those two groups of people.
Yeah, so quite multifaceted as a
yes.
approach. Yeah. And so let's dive right in with the kind of headlines. How good or bad are managers in the UK today? Because it was a UK-focused study, right? We're not kind of talking internationally.
Yeah, it was. And actually, we've just published a report at the end of February called Management in UK 2030, which actually looks at some of the international comparisons between the quality of UK management compared with other industrial nations, the leading pack of high productivity countries, if you like. And that research is grounded very much in the academic research, people like sort of Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen and people like that. But we've gathered a whole range of evidence. I think where we are in the UK is we're not all bad. I don't think we should do ourselves down. I think we should celebrate there's a lot of high quality management across the piece. We're just outside the leading pack, however, and this really does matter. And in the report that you referenced just now, we talk about UK PLC because I think this does have national consequences. A gap in management capability means that productivity is less than it would have been had we had higher management capability across time, and obviously that impacts growth, living standards, public investment in public services, and so on. So the quality of management is, we're not quite where the US's, the Germany's, and so on are in the world. But if we were, we'd be in a much better place as a national economy.
Yes. Okay, that's really helpful by way of kind of setting the landscape out in terms of the UK's managerial capability relative to kind of, I guess, productive other countries. And interesting to hear what you say. Actually, it sounds like there's quite a definite link between management skills and productivity of a given country.
Yeah, and the research suggests actually up to half of our gap in productivity compared with our leading pack is to do with management capability. Now,
Okay.
it's quite complex because, of course, management capability sits within international supply chains across sectors. It is to do about with training and development. It's to do with experience, mindset, culture, and so on. So it's not like just there is a deficit. So what we have to do is just plug it magically by doing more management training. It's not as simplistic as that. But across time, we've been just slightly behind that leading pack, and that costs us dearly. And in terms of the survey work that we did, I'd say it's split in terms of workers' assessment of their managers, and that's a critical relationship, the line management relationship with a member of staff or a worker. I'd say about 2/3 think that their managers are broadly effective, and a third think they are ineffective. That's just from the perspective of the member of staff. So a third of workers may be having a suboptimal experience with their manager, and if you're having a bad experience with your manager, you're far more likely to leave, underperform, and your well-being is more likely to be affected.
Yes, it has such a critical um, link to somebody's likelihood of staying long term, of being motivated in their work, isn't it? That line manager relationship is so crucial, and so that's the impact, I guess, of effective or otherwise management on team individuals. What are some of the consequences for teams more generally if they have a manager who's not really equipped to or had the necessary support and training to manage the team well? What happens as a result?
Well, we asked a whole series of questions around working life, organisational performance, experience of work as part of the survey, and we were able to split the attitudes of those who have an ineffective manager versus those who have an effective manager. I can run down the list of statements. I feel valued and appreciated, motivated to do a good job. I'm satisfied in my current job. I find my work meaningful. We recommend my organization. Think the organization has a good company culture, and I'm happy with my pay, compensation, and benefits. Now, if you've got an effective manager, in general, the answer to those statements was affirmative at a scale of greater than about 65-70%. If you have an ineffective manager, the numbers are more around sort of 15%, 25%, 40% at a peak, 20, 22, and so on. So that delta is enormous between those two experiences. Now, what that means is if you are a business or an organization that is turning a blind eye to an effective manager, not investing in the quality and capability of your management, then your organizational performance will suffer enormously, because all those things around trust, effectiveness, and so on, they play through into organizational performance as well as individual well-being. And that's why we see in the more macro data a link between good management and productivity performance. So there is a thread that runs from the individual to the manager to the company or organization to the regional and national economy, if you like. And that thread is good management.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I was just kind of picturing that thread as you started to describe it, because you've talked about the consequences for the individual and consequences for the team, but also much more at the macro level for business performance generally and for UK productivity, etc. And when it comes to line manager training, we'll get a bit more into kind of what management skills training should look like, perhaps. But one of the things I often hear when I talk to organisations and ask them about, what do you provide by way of training to people stepping into people management roles for the first time? What I hear anecdotally is that they do provide training, but it tends to be very nuts and bolts in its nature. Like, here's how you use the HR system to approve somebody's pay, or here's how do X task, using our HR system, or here's the policy and the guide on why. It's not so much about the actual people management skill set. Is that something you explored in the data, or you're aware of in other ways, or is that just what I'm hearing?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, massively. So what you're given basically is what you need to exist as somebody who has the job title manager in some way, shape, or form, rather than to develop the skills and capabilities around being a manager. And that's a crucial distinction, and obviously a key data point that we've highlighted quite frequently. I'm sure a lot of your a lot of your audience would have seen it in the press and so on, is this concept of the accidental manager. It's the manager who becomes a manager, not having had any sort of meaningful formal training into how to manage. And 82% of managers became managers without that formal training. I'm one, I'll fess up. I first became a manager without that formal training. And I'm sure, it's 82% of the vast majority of people who are probably just staring slightly nervously at their past CVs, have been through that process. And, having been through that process, how ill-equipped you were for actually performing the role. You believed you could do it, perhaps because you're ambitious, but when you got there, you didn't have the emotional, practical, experiential toolkit that you needed to do the job well. And not only that, you didn't necessarily know where to find those capabilities, resources, those supports that you need.
Yeah, that is such an astonishing statistic, and one I've mentioned to clients myself recently. That 82% figure. It's very shocking, but I think also it does at the same time sound quite familiar. I don't think I'd had anything rigorous in terms of, you know, people manager training, um, and skill development before taking people on. In fact, I was thinking I was at a later stage in my career, my very first line manager responsibility, absolutely zero, thrown in at the deep end in retail, and just,
Yes.
figure it out as you go along. Um,
Yeah.
so
And isn't that crazy when you think about it? Pretty much any other role that you go into as a progression, an entry level role, sometimes you have to just sort of sink or swim a bit. That's not right, but that's just sometimes how it is. You mentioned retail. I'm sure it's like that in lots of parts of the retail sector and hospitality and so on. But what other type of role, whether it's in engineering or tech or healthcare, management or public administration, would you be thrown into a role which you demonstrated almost no capability to do, other than that you're a decent person, and you weren't given the tools and resources you needed to do that job technically very well.
yeah,
But because it's not, management is less about a sort of technical knowledge base, and it's more about a capability set. We seem for some reason to regard that as a different thing, and something that is less worthy of care and attention. And I think that's part of the reason that why the UK is behind the leading pack, because I think those in that leading pack actually have a different approach to it, is my sense.
yeah, I think that's so true. We are so much more casual and accepting of, whether somebody has, been had the opportunity to develop proper management capability, before they're promoted into a first-time manager role, or indeed whether they've been demonstrating that effectively before they're then promoted up to be a manager of managers, for example. And I'm
Yes.
sure that for managers who do step into that manager role, maybe for the first time, or who take on a new team or something, it must affect them, the knowledge that I'm slightly winging this at times, or I may not have access to the right tools, or I wonder if I'm doing this the way everyone else is doing it. So, what happens when people without management training get promoted into management roles? Does it affect their confidence and their progression?
I think some of that depends on the individual, but I think that the sense that you're winging a bit is something that, again, anyone who is ill prepared to a management role would have experienced. I mean, you can do things that look like management to give yourself the sense that you're being a good manager, because there's lots of performative things that you can do. You can do the one-to-ones, you can fill in the forms, you can give emotional support, and some of those are all good things. But to do it systematically, I think requires a deeper knowledge base, and I think that's where you either have to have really good mentors and coaches, a good employer environment to learn from, and or undertake sort of more formal training that is based in sort of deep standards and with some rigorous application. And I think those are the things we've got to be more prepared to lean into.
Yes, and I know obviously the CMI offers fantastic training and accreditation for managers. That's a big part of your reason for existing, as I understand it. There's also, from I guess my experience over the years in talking to different organisations, it's quite powerful, that element of peer support as well, isn't it? So giving managers the opportunity to meet with other managers and talk about the things that they find challenging or the things that have worked for them in different and difficult situations as well.
Yeah, peer support is crucial. You shouldn't be alone in the management endeavor. Learning from others and sometimes sharing your pain. I think that's a perfectly healthy thing to be able to do, as well as get that sort of collaborative learning opportunity. Coaches and mentors are important. I think, again, reflecting on my own career, I don't sort of personalize this too much, but I did get a coach at one point, and what I found from that experience is it enabled me to look more objectively at situations, and take a step back and problem solve in sometimes some very emotionally fraught or challenging situations, to take that step back and think about things objectively, and taking the time and care to get things as right as you probably never get everything right or you get it all right, but that time and care is important, and that was a key thing, for me. And then I think the thing that management qualifications are different types. I mean, obviously CMI, you can become a chartered manager. We accredit management apprenticeships, and we dual accredit higher education courses, management degrees, and so on. And those are all very good routes. But there's others as well. There's the Help to Grow scheme. Goldman Sachs do a very good sort of growth support scheme that gives some management support. There's lots of other things as well. But I think what that can do is give you the theory and the case material to apply to your everyday, which is so important, as well as assessing what you're doing and how you're thinking and how you're acting and the impacts that it's having, in a way that can be meaningful, and obviously enable you to learn and become more effective over time.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it's that kind of very ongoing reflection and learning that helps you, as much as anything, grow your effectiveness as a manager and grow your skills in that area. And I guess getting regular feedback from people about, what's landing well with people with the way you're managing versus perhaps what you could be paying more attention to or doing things differently. So all that kind of constant cycle of feedback and reflection must be really helpful. And you were just talking then about the
But
train.
just before we
Sorry,
go off
yeah.
that point,
Mm.
so So just before we go off that point, sorry to interrupt. I think there's a key point you've touched on there. There is, of course, one group of people that will provide you the best learning opportunities that you could possibly hope for, and they're in close proximity to you. They're the people that you manage, right? And one of the stats that came through in the survey is that people with management qualifications are far more likely to ask those they manage for feedback than those who don't have that. And I think there's a reason for this. It's because you've got to give people support and ensure their well-being as far as it's possible to do so, but there are learning opportunities for yourself as well as a manager, and you'd be foolish not to take them, because as long as you have a psychologically safe environment, as long as you have an environment of trust, and I think good managers generally will cultivate that, then you will find those you line manage, if asked, will give you some very honest feedback, and that's really useful. And it makes you better, it makes the team better, it helps them be better. So yes, peer learning, but get that information and resource from those you're line managing as well.
Yeah, it's so valuable, isn't it? And it might be in line with what you think they're going to say, or it might reveal some little blind spots because we may have a certain view of what we're doing well, and then that's complemented by other people's perspectives. So, and even if there's a difficult message in there, I think knowing how to hear them and respond to them and let yourself reflect on it for a bit and then figure out how am I going to respond to that feedback is such a valuable skill if you want to carry on progressing in your career and up the management ladder, I guess, into more
Yes.
significant
Yeah.
leadership roles. Yeah.
Yes.
That's
Definitely.
really interesting stat you just shared there. And I mean, coming back to the training, did you look into that in your research? Is there a pattern around who gets access to training and who doesn't? Does it vary by industry? Is it more prevalent for first time managers? What's the picture there?
It's very difficult to tell industry by industry on the basis of the data that we did, just because even that was a large sample size. It's difficult to break it down. You need a really big public data set to do that. And there is a public data set that is due to be published later on this year that's collected by the Office of National Statistics. And we're looking forward to digging into that data. It's called the Management Expectations Survey, and we'll have our number crunchers primed and ready to go when it's published. But what we did spot in the data that we gathered is that there are some demographic differences. If you are white and male, you are far more likely to have had access to leadership training or qualifications throughout your career than if you were from a minority ethnic background, or if you were female. So there's clearly some differences there. By the way, you're also far more likely as a man to think that you've had enough leadership and training, and you really don't need any more than if you're a woman. So there's an overconfidence factor at play here, but there is also a different there is a differential access point, and I sense that the majority of the factors driving that are down to over time the expectations of who's going to get the opportunity to be promoted, who gets the opportunities at the stretch projects, and then sort of training becoming part of that process at some point. So I think what we're picking up is just some sources of social immobility, if you like, that are reflected in access to management training. Now,
Yes.
having
So
said that, by the way, in terms of some of the training areas I talked about, like management apprenticeships, particularly at higher levels, we actually are starting to see more women than men undertake apprenticeships at higher levels. It's true not just in management, by the way. It's across other fields as well. And though many from ethnic minority backgrounds are accessing those level 6 and level 7, there's something very appealing around the degree level apprenticeships that enable you to earn and learn at the same time. And there seems to be the beginnings of some rebalancing at the top end of the qualifications scale. So we'll have to see how that plays out over time.
that's really interesting. So people are increasingly seeing the value of that higher level manager skill accreditation through the apprenticeship route, and I guess presumably to help them land those slightly more senior roles, more permanent roles.
Yes, definitely. I think the apprenticeships, the much maligned apprenticeship system with the apprenticeship levy and so on, it's a bit of a mystery to us, I have to say, as to why it's so maligned. Because this is probably we've existed now for over 75 years. The management apprenticeship route, which in earnest began in sort of 2016, 2017, has been an enormous boost to people undertaking management qualifications. We've done some number crunching there as well, and we can see there's productivity boost for their employers as well. We can see what's happened to people's wages and make some assumptions and so on. So they're benefiting as individuals. The employers are benefiting in terms of an uplift in productivity, and you generally go on a route of progression if you do a management apprenticeship. That benefits public services, by the way, where there's more than half of management apprenticeships are actually in public services, the NHS, police, and so on. So there's a very good story there. there's a slightly sort of superficial media attack on that story. Now, I would say that, and of course, it's important to us. So, in terms of promoting better management and leadership, but I think it says something around where our mindset is as a country towards management and leadership. The fact that we feel it's so peculiar that people further on in their career should want to develop their management skills, and they're sort of free riding under the allegation almost that they're free riding on the system, or their employer is free riding on the system. I think our perception is actually the opposite to that actually this is a critical national investment that needs to be safeguarded because it's driving improved performance and some good outcomes on the social mobility front.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I remember hearing that in the media a few years ago about how companies were sending their middle managers onto kind of MBA type training programs, and it wasn't really being used, the levy, in the way it was intended. It was a little bit critical, that the coverage of that. But I think your argument that actually any investment in strengthening manager capability is only going to be beneficial to your teams, to your business performance, and to industries, and both public service ones and private sector ones, and therefore to the country's level of productivity and growth overall. So let's not squabble about it, but let's just up the level of investment generally in making it happen. Yeah. And so let's get really practical before we wrap up and talk about what are some of the things. So if somebody's listening to this who maybe leads a team or is running a chunk of a business or a whole business, and they're thinking, yeah, I think we probably have a bit of a manager capability gap here that we could address. What would you recommend they look at doing? What are some of the practical things that they could do to start improving the manager capability?
I think thinking about what it means to be an effective manager is a good starting point. And now, underpinning our work is a set of professional standards. There will be others that are quite similar, but there's probably four key elements to those professional standards. One at the core of it is being ethical, inclusive. Increasing sustainability is part of that core mindset and skill set that we all need. And then around that, obviously, you've got to think about what's going to deliver effective performance, what's going to manage effective processes, deliver outcomes, set the right targets, manage that process of being a successful team or department or organization. So that sort of traditional performance aspect of it is important. But then I think in your management framework, you've got to think about the manager themselves. And we've talked about this a little already. Think about their ability to learn, to self-reflect, to manage their emotions, to develop themselves and their capability set. What does that look like? And then finally, there's a sort of relational aspect, if you like. How do you work with others? How do you collaborate effectively? How do you develop others? And go back to those management apprenticeships. Over 90% of management apprentices say they consider it very important and a core part of their role to develop others. So those are the sorts of mindsets that you want to see within your managers. So I think it's those things, sort of core values, process, performance, innovation, self-management, and interrelating, supporting, collaborating with others, listening being an important part of that, of course. So I think those are things you've got to ask yourself: do our managers have consciously these skill sets, mindsets, behaviours? And if they don't, then you need to think about what it is you need to do to develop that within your organisation and using outside support.
Yes, thank you. That's a really helpful way of framing the question and guiding people towards which bits of the answer they would benefit from really focusing on. And I mean, a final thought has just plopped into my mind, which I haven't yet asked, but I'm suddenly curious to know the answer to, which is when you look at the trend line around management capability, are we on an upwards trend? Are we gradually improving at investing and growing management skills and capability, or does it bounce around, or is it less optimistic than that?
It's very difficult to tell, and I think the good thing about the survey set that I mentioned before that's about to be published, it's a second in a series, so we'll be able to track progress across time. The data over time is a little scant. What I would say is, the drivers of change tend to be things like growing engagement with international trade and competition. That seems to drive improved management performance and capability. In the UK, obviously, we've had a bit of a hiccup there in the past few years. So I would imagine, that driver isn't strong. We haven't gone backwards, but we probably haven't gone forward either. Things like policy driven change, like the management apprenticeships, which was ultimately a policy driven change to do with the levy. That is a boost. There is a growth in business schools and management degrees. There has been over the last 10, 20 years. And that seems to have met some of the needs. So that's positive. So I think on the training and education side, there's a positive story. On the market and economy side, there is probably a less good story overall, although it will be huge variability. I guess on the public services side, and we're starting to see the NHS prioritise quality of management leadership even more consciously and deliberately. So I think there's an emerging story there, and it could well become a good story over the next few years. The same with sort of government and civil service. Recently, the Cabinet Office published its sort of people strategy, had a very deep focus on management and leadership. There are some bright spots around sort of regional economies. So West Midlands Combined Authority published its skills strategy, had a very big section on management capability and inclusive management, i.e. opening up management to more disadvantaged individuals and communities. So it's a variable picture. I don't think we're doing enough that is concerted enough. I don't think we have a positive enough public dialogue about it. I don't think we have a focus on management and why it's important when we talk about the future of public services and public service reform, when we talk about the productivity puzzle, when we talk about regional growth and rebalancing. We talk about big, shiny infrastructure things, which of course are very, 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 very important. We talk about particular sort of skills like AI, digital, and so on. We miss the management story. And whenever you put your hand up, and as the Chartered Management Institute, we always say, "What about management?" You then get a sort of absolute recognition. So, oh yes, of course, we know it's important. All the data shows that it's very important, but it never seems to make it into the story or into the policy or into the strategy, or at least not in a consistent enough way. So I think overall, this is a very long answer to your very good but a very short question. But overall, I think it's a mixed picture, but we aren't doing enough of the things in a determined enough fashion, consistently enough, to see that gap between us and the best start to really close over time.
Yes, thank you for that brilliant bird's eye view and of where things are improving and why, and where some of the, I guess, barriers to closing the gap with those other international leaders of the pack that you mentioned at the beginning are. It's been absolutely fascinating. If people want to find out more about the work of the CMI or connect with you professionally, what's the best way for them to do that?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. Connect with CMI on LinkedIn. We're very active there. Anything we're sort of publishing or doing will tend to appear as a sort of LinkedIn post. By all means, go to managers.org.uk. If you want to know more, if you want to discover about the professional standards that I was talking about, or the qualifications that CMI provides, or the research and policy work will be on there as well. So those are the main areas. And if you do those things, I'm sure you can get a sort of deeper insight to a lot of our emerging thinking.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. And I'll pop those links in the show notes for people listening, and links to the reports that you've already shared publicly that we've been talking through. Thank you so much for coming on the show, enlightening us all about the state of management skills and capability, and just why it's so important for individuals, for teams, for businesses, and for prosperity across our country as well. It's been a really fascinating deep dive into the question of management and how to be good managers and why they matter. Thank you so much for being a brilliant guest.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for having me.